Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today, in this video, we're going to look at one of my favorite orchids in my collection, and that is Phalaenopsis Flying Eagle Wilson. The reason I find this orchid very fascinating and interesting is that it has Tetraspis C1 in its parentage, and Tetraspis C1 is an orchid species that would have different color combination on its petals and sepals. And the most typical one that you see will be red-white combination, and this one has red-yellow combination, but it does have that trait of having different color potential. So back in April 2019, this orchid was blooming with two flowers. The first flower on the left here has a petal on the top right that is more a combo of red and yellow, and then the second flower on the right, you can see the whole flower, including its petals and sepals, are pretty much in red. So it's an interesting contrast between the two flowers. And it does also have a really nice fragrance, which I adore. And then fast forward, now we're at the beginning of June 2019. That's when I first started taking photos to document the further development of this orchid's spike and bud development. And I think it's because it's closer to the summertime where we have hotter temperature. So the speed of the additional spike development, as well as the buds development, it was just a lot faster compared to the first flower when they were trying to mature, grow, to bloom. It took a lot longer than these three buds. And going back in time, I compared last year's blooming the time frame or timeline for this orchid last year against this year's blooming time. It's pretty much relatively similar, the same. So I think this orchid, it's on its regular typical blooming cycle, blooming pattern. Now, because it has sequential, has that sequential blooming characteristic, so for this year I have at least two small blooming cycles. So when these orchids were in buds, I was being extremely careful, and by that I mean there are a couple different factors that may potentially contribute to bud blast, and I may have shared my opinions on the reasons that will cause bud blast in my other videos, but we can talk about those again in this video just so you know. The first one really is temperature, and the second one would be humidity, and then the third one is whether there is a lot of moving around of the orchid. And then the fourth one has to do with the overall orchid health, whether there is any rot within the root system, or if there is any stem rot or crown rot, or any kind of pest infestation. So these are the four main things that I think would contribute to bud blast. So what I could do in my environment was I basically used my central air to control the temperature, just so that it doesn't fluctuate too much. The second one is I do use a humidifier when I feel the humidity is too low, and you could go online and buy a temperature and humidity meter, and that's usually like around $10. It's not super expensive, and I think it's an investment that will be well made. And then with regards to whether I move this orchid or not, okay, so because this orchid is in semi-hydro setup, and because I have already figured out the amount of water this orchid would need and require to complete that wet-dry cycle without me having to take it over to the sink to get extra water So this orchid really only receives at most quarter cup of water. Usually I would start with 1/8 of a cup, and then I would see how it does in midweek and see if I want to add another 1/8 of a cup. So altogether, we're really looking at about quarter cup altogether for a 7-day wet dry cycle. And the last thing is, obviously, this orchid is really healthy and is free of any pest problem. So for the first 3 reasons or factors, I could control them. So this orchid this year so far hasn't had any bud blasted. So it's a really good thing. Now, so we're now at summertime, and this is the full bloom of the 3 buds. And this time, you see that the last flower has a pure yellow petal, and then the flower behind it has a slightly pink petal. The pink is toward the center, and then we have another one that has kind of yellow edge on both of its petal. So overall, I think this orchid is just so interesting. It's just as interesting as Tetraspis C1. But I noticed that the color difference and variations tend to be on the petals for this particular orchid cross, whereas Tetraspis C1, the random red-white distribution is in full either petal or sepal. For this one, it mostly happens on the petal. So that's my observation. And I also have received some questions regarding orchid care or fertilization before bloom, during bloom, or post bloom. So during bloom is the period when orchids are in bloom. That's the time that I'm kind of on the fence about giving fertilizer. Some people have shared with me that with balanced fertilizer, quarter strength of it can help orchid have longer blooming cycle. But I'm still testing it out, and I haven't really found any hard evidence or scientific research or documentation to really tell me that is indeed the truth. It may also depend on orchid types as well as environment. But definitely before and after bloom, you will need to somehow provide certain level of fertilizer just so that this orchid can grow. Now, after bloom, that's when you really need to, well, at least I would make sure that I first look at whether this orchid really needs more water. So I want to first make sure this orchid is properly hydrated, is not dehydrated, and then I will gradually introduce a nitrogen-based fertilizer for this orchid to focus on its energy on root production and leaf production. But also, you need to take into consideration for the season. When the orchid is out of bloom at the end of summer, when the temperature is still high, you can probably give the fertilizer quicker, earlier, even with higher concentration. But if the orchid is out of bloom when it's slightly colder, you might want to do it slowly, or reduce the strength of the fertilizer that you give it. Because based on my understanding, and this is something that other orchid hobbyists have shared with me, is that higher temperature tend to increase the efficiency for the orchid to intake fertilizer, or allow the fertilizer to break down better so that the orchid can absorb the nutrients. But on the other hand, when the temperature is lower, the efficiency is not as great. So you do have to look at the season, the temperature, but then most important of all, look at the leaves and look at the roots and see if this orchid is slightly dehydrated or really dehydrated. Make sure that it's well hydrated, has enough water, because I think even without fertilizer, having enough water is basic necessity, a basic requirement for a orchid to establish a good baseline, good foundation to be able to grow further, to grow into its next bloom cycle. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!